With just 30 days before the bank took his family farm, Thomas dug up a heavy iron safe buried under an abandoned barn. But the shocking secret locked inside wasn't gold or money, it was a 30-year-old mystery that would change the farming world forever. The wind in North Dakota doesn't just blow, it bites. It sweeps across the flat, white plains like a howling freight train, turning the world into an endless, freezing ocean of snow. It is a harsh, unforgiving place, yet it holds a strange and quiet beauty. For generations, this icy land has tested the toughest farmers in the world. And today it was testing Thomas Hayes. Thomas, a 45-year-old cattleman, pushed his heavy wooden barn door shut, fighting the bitter wind. His face was weathered from years of working in the freezing cold, and his shoulders carried a heavy, quiet exhaustion. But the moment he stepped inside the warm, dimly lit barn, his eyes softened. His breath plumed in the chilly air as he walked slowly down the center aisle, gently patting the thick, dark coats of his Angus cows. Thomas was never a man of many words, but his animals meant the world to him. He had spent his entire life on this ranch, learning the quiet language of livestock, waking up long before the sun, and working until his hands ached. He loved this life with all his heart. But right now this life was slipping through his fingers. Standing under the flickering yellow light of the barn, Thomas pulled his frozen leather gloves off. From the inside pocket of his heavy canvas coat, he pulled out a single piece of paper. It was crumpled, stained with morning coffee, and folded so many times it was starting to tear at the edges. It was a final notice from the county bank. The bold, black letters at the top of the page spelled out a farmer's worst nightmare: notice of foreclosure. Over the last 3 years, the North Dakota winters had been completely brutal. Late, unexpected blizzards had frozen his crops before they could ever be harvested, and deeply icy storms had taken a heavy, tragic toll on his livestock numbers. Despite working day and night, pushing his body to the absolute limit, Thomas had fallen too far behind. The number sitting at the very bottom of the page was terrifying: $500,000. He folded the letter slowly, his chest tight with a heavy, sinking feeling. He didn't have $500,000. He didn't even have a fraction of it. But the bank didn't care about the bad weather, and they didn't care about how hard he had worked to keep his animals fed. The letter gave him exactly 30 days. One short month. If Thomas couldn't find the money by then, the bank was going to take it all. His land, his cows, and his family's century-old legacy would be completely liquidated at the county's massive spring farm equipment auction. He could already picture the terrifying scene: strangers walking across his beloved land, the fast-talking auctioneer selling off the tractors his father taught him to drive, and heavy trucks loading his animals into rusty trailers to be taken away forever. Thomas looked down at his muddy boots, listening to the soft, peaceful breathing of the cows around him. He was out of time, out of money, and almost out of hope. But as the freezing wind screamed against the wooden walls of the barn, a quiet spark of determination lit up in his tired eyes. He wasn't going to lose his family's farm. Not without the fight of his life. The air inside the First County Bank was too warm and smelled like lemon cleaner and fresh coffee. It was a completely different world from the freezing, wind-blown ranch Thomas had just left. He sat awkwardly in a soft, leather chair, feeling too big for it. His thick canvas jacket was still cold to the touch, and his heavy work boots left small, damp rings of melting snow on the perfectly clean carpet. Across the wide, shiny desk sat Mr. Harrison, the bank manager. Mr. Harrison was not an evil man. He wore a neat gray suit and spoke in a polite, steady voice. But in the farming business, a polite voice could still destroy your entire life. "Thomas," Mr. Harrison said gently, folding his clean white hands on the desk. "You know I respect you. I respected your father. But $500,000 is a mountain of debt. The board of directors has made their decision. We have to move forward with the foreclosure." Thomas swallowed hard, his rough hands gripping the arms of the chair. "I just need a little more time, Mr. Harrison. The spring calves will bring in good money. I can sell off a few acres of the south pasture." Mr. Harrison shook his head slowly. "It's not enough, Thomas. The spring auction is already set. In fact, we already have private buyers calling us." Thomas looked up, his heart skipping a beat. "Buyers?" "Yes," the manager nodded. "They want the land, of course. But honestly, Thomas, they are mostly after the machinery. Specifically, your father's collection of vintage farm equipment. Those classic tractors and old plows are worth a lot of money to rich collectors. They are ready to bid high." The words felt like a physical punch to Thomas's chest. His father had spent his entire life saving and restoring that old equipment. Those machines were not just metal and rubber, they were the heart of the Hayes family history. They were memories of his father teaching him how to drive, how to fix an engine, and how to love the land. The thought of rich strangers buying them as shiny toys made Thomas sick to his stomach. Thomas leaned forward. He didn't shout, but his low, rough voice carried a heavy power. "Mr. Harrison, my family has worked that land for over 100 years. My father built that legacy with his bare hands. I am not going to let it be sold off in pieces to strangers. Thomas, the paperwork is done." "Please," Thomas interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me 30 days on that notice. Give me those 30 days. Don't send anyone to my property before the clock runs out. I will find a way to fix this." Mr. Harrison looked into Thomas's desperate, determined eyes. For a long moment, the quiet hum of the bank's heater was the only sound in the room. Finally, the manager let out a long, heavy sigh. "All right, Thomas. You have exactly 30 days. We will not bother you until then," Mr. Harrison said softly. But then his face grew very serious. "But I have to warn you. The auction company is already hired. The tow trucks are already booked and on standby. If you don't have a check for $500,000 by the morning of the auction, those trucks are driving through your gate. And I won't be able to stop them." Thomas stood up, his jaw set wide and firm. "They won't need to," he said. He turned and walked out into the freezing North Dakota wind, the ticking clock louder than ever in his mind. That night, the wind howled outside, but inside the main barn, it was quiet except for the soft crunching of hay. Thomas worked late, his breath freezing in the cold air as he carried heavy buckets of feed to his remaining cattle. His muscles burned with deep exhaustion. As he watched the gentle animals eat, his mind drifted to his late father, William Hayes. William had been a brilliant livestock farmer, a man who seemed to understand animals better than people. But he was also deeply secretive. Thomas remembered how his father would spend long hours alone, constantly writing in small leather notebooks, keeping his ideas hidden from the rest of the world. William always said a good farmer plans not just for the next season, but for the next generation. Thomas sighed, feeling like he had failed that generation. He picked up his rusty lantern and walked into the cramped, dusty feed room at the back of the barn. He needed to move the last few 50-pound sacks of grain. The feed room was dark and freezing. Thomas grabbed the rough fabric of a heavy sack and dragged it across the floor. He lifted it onto his shoulder, but as he shifted his weight, his heavy work boots slammed down onto an old wooden floorboard. Crack! The dry, rotted wood broke completely under his weight. Thomas stumbled back, dropping the heavy grain sack. He grabbed his lantern and held it low to inspect the damage. There was a jagged hole in the floor. But as he looked closer, he realized the space underneath wasn't just empty dirt. It was a perfectly carved-out, hollow square. It was a deliberate hiding spot. Thomas knelt down, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. He reached his thick, gloved hand into the dark hole. His fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. He pulled it out into the dim yellow light. It was a small, sealed glass mason jar. Inside the jar was a tightly rolled piece of paper. Thomas quickly wiped the heavy dust off the glass. His hands were shaking slightly as he unscrewed the rusty metal lid. He pulled the paper out and gently unrolled it. Instantly, warm tears stung his eyes. It was his father's messy, familiar handwriting. The note was short, but it sent a powerful shock wave through Thomas's entire body. "Tommy," the note began. "If you are reading this, it means the winters have been cruel, the money is gone, and times have gotten dark. But do not lose hope. I always knew the storms would get worse. I left a hidden legacy for you, something to save our home when all else fails." Thomas stopped breathing for a second. A hidden legacy? To save the farm? He quickly read the final lines of the letter, which sounded like a riddle. "You will find it waiting in the place where life used to begin. Go to the edge of the bitter wind, where the snow drifts the highest. My greatest work is sleeping there." Thomas slowly lowered the paper. He knew exactly where the riddle pointed. The place where life used to begin. He looked out the small, frosty window of the feed room, staring into the dark, howling night. Far across the property, sitting completely alone on the deadliest, snowiest edge of the ranch, was the old calving barn. It was the place where newborn calves used to take their very first steps. But it had been boarded up and locked with heavy iron padlocks for over 20 years. Thomas gripped the paper tightly. The bank's clock was ticking, but his father had just given him a map to salvation. Thomas didn't wait for morning. The note in his pocket burned with hope. He grabbed a heavy steel crowbar and a large flashlight, wrapped his thick wool scarf tightly around his face, and pushed open the main barn door. Instantly the North Dakota blizzard swallowed him whole. The freezing wind screamed in his ears, blasting sharp ice crystals against his skin. The snow was already knee-deep and blowing wildly. Walking to the far edge of the property felt like climbing a mountain. Every single step took an enormous amount of effort. In the distance, the old calving barn sat alone in the darkness, looking like a forgotten ghost ship lost in an ocean of white snow. The howling wind pushed hard against Thomas's chest, trying to force him to turn around, but the memory of the ticking clock kept his legs moving forward. Finally, he reached the massive wooden doors of the abandoned barn. They were swollen with freezing moisture and stuck solid. A large, rust-covered iron padlock held them tightly shut. Thomas raised his heavy steel crowbar. With a loud grunt of effort, he smashed it down onto the lock. Once, twice, 3 times. With a sharp crack, the old rusty metal broke apart. Thomas pulled the heavy doors open and stepped out of the roaring storm. He pushed the doors closed behind him, and the sudden, dead silence inside was eerie. He clicked his flashlight on. The bright yellow beam cut through the freezing darkness. The barn had not been touched in 20 years. Thick, dusty cobwebs hung from the ceiling like old fishing nets. The cold air smelled of dry dirt and frozen, forgotten hay. He walked slowly toward the largest birthing pen in the very back of the barn. But the pen was completely buried under a giant mountain of rotten wooden pallets, old tractor tires and torn canvas tarps. Thomas dropped his crowbar and started dragging the heavy junk away. The rotting wood splintered against his thick gloves. He threw pallet after pallet behind him, his breath puffing in the cold air like steam. After 10 minutes of exhausting work, his heavy boot hit something solid. It wasn't wood and it wasn't dirt. It was metal. Thomas fell to his knees and quickly brushed the dirt and hay away with his hands. His heart hammered wildly in his chest. Buried directly into the concrete floor was a massive heavy iron floor safe. It was thick, dark, and looked strong enough to survive an earthquake. "I found it," Thomas whispered, a huge smile finally breaking across his tired face. He leaned down close to open it. But as the flashlight beam hit the center of the iron door, Thomas's smile vanished completely. His stomach dropped like a heavy stone. There was no spinning combination dial. There were no numbers to turn. Right in the middle of the heavy iron door was a strange, deep, and very unusual keyhole. It didn't look like a normal lock at all. It clearly required a very specific, heavy, custom-made key to open it. Panic started to rise in Thomas's throat. He grabbed his flashlight and frantically searched the entire birthing pen. He looked under every rotting piece of wood, checked every rusty old shelf, and dug through the freezing dirt until his hands ached. He searched for nearly an hour, but he found absolutely nothing. Thomas slumped down onto the dirty floor, resting his head against the freezing iron safe. He had found his father's hidden legacy, the one thing that could save his family's farm. But he was completely locked out. Thomas sat on the freezing dirt floor, staring blankly at the locked iron safe. He was so close. The answer to all his prayers was sitting just inches away, but it was completely sealed behind heavy metal. He pulled his gloves off and rubbed his tired face, taking a deep, shaky breath. Desperate, he reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out his father's handwritten note one more time. He aimed his flashlight at the paper, reading the riddle over again. He searched the messy, familiar letters for anything he might have missed in his rush. Then he saw it. At the very bottom of the page, written in much smaller letters, was a final sentence he hadn't fully understood the first time. "When the doors are locked, ask the green giant that never sleeps." Thomas froze. The green giant that never sleeps. His mind raced. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't a mountain. It was a machine. He jumped to his feet, his heart suddenly pounding with fresh adrenaline. He grabbed his flashlight, pushed the heavy barn doors open, and charged back out into the furious blizzard. He didn't care about the biting wind or the blinding snow blowing against his face. He ran as fast as his heavy boots could carry him toward the large metal machinery shed near the main house. He slid the heavy shed door open and stepped inside, quickly clicking on the overhead lights. The shed was freezing cold, but safe from the howling wind outside. In the very center of the room sat a massive shape completely covered by a thick canvas tarp. Thomas grabbed the edge of the stiff canvas and pulled it back. There it was. His father's absolute pride and joy, a perfectly restored classic John Deere tractor. Its deep green paint and bright yellow wheels gleamed beautifully under the lights. His father had spent years rebuilding this magnificent machine piece by piece. It was the exact same tractor the bank's rich buyers were so eager to steal away at the upcoming auction. Thomas climbed quickly into the freezing cab of the tractor. His hands moved fast, searching everywhere. First, he opened the metal toolbox on the side. Nothing but a few rusty wrenches. Next, he lifted the worn leather seat, shining his light into the dark space underneath. Nothing but dust. He reached behind the old dashboard, feeling blindly around the wires and gauges. Still nothing. Frustration started to build inside his chest. He sat down heavily in the driver's seat, gripping the cold steering wheel. "Where did you hide it, Dad?" Thomas whispered to the empty shed. As he looked down, his eyes locked onto the metal casing covering the steering column. Right near the base, hidden down by the foot pedals, there was a small square metal panel. It was completely flush with the rest of the green metal, but the paint around the edges looked slightly scratched. It was a custom modification his father must have made. Thomas pulled a flathead screwdriver from his pocket and wedged it into the tiny gap. He twisted it hard. The panel popped off with a sharp snap. He held his breath and reached his bare hand deep into the dark, hidden cavity. At first there was only cold air. But then, his fingertips brushed against something solid and heavy. He grabbed it and slowly pulled it out into the light. It was a dark, oily rag tied tightly with a piece of string. Thomas untied it with shaking fingers and unrolled the dirty cloth. Resting inside was a massive, custom-forged brass key. Its teeth were strange and jagged, perfectly matching the unusual keyhole on the floor safe. Thomas gripped the cold brass tightly in his hand. He had the key. Now it was time to open the vault. Thomas clutched the heavy brass key tightly in his fist. He sprinted out of the machinery shed and straight back into the terrifying blizzard. The storm had grown much worse. The wind was no longer just howling, it was roaring like an angry beast. Snow whipped across his face, completely blinding him. But Thomas didn't slow down. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. He fought his way through the deep snowbanks, driven purely by adrenaline and hope. He finally crashed through the doors of the old calving barn, shoving them shut to block out the violent storm. He fell to his knees in the dirt, gasping for air. His flashlight beam hit the massive iron floor safe, waiting exactly where he left it. Thomas didn't waste a second. He leaned over the dark metal and carefully slid the large brass key into the strange keyhole. It fit perfectly. He gripped the handle of the key and twisted hard. At first the old rusty lock resisted. Then with a loud, heavy click the internal gears finally shifted. Thomas grabbed the thick iron handle on the door and pulled with all his strength. The heavy lid groaned loudly as it swung open, revealing a deep, dark cavity below the floor. Thomas quickly shined his flashlight inside. He held his breath, expecting to see stacks of $100 bills, shiny gold coins, or expensive bank bonds that could instantly wipe out his massive debt. But as the yellow light hit the bottom of the safe, his stomach sank completely. There was no money. There was no gold. Resting at the bottom of the vault was nothing but a neat stack of thick, black, waterproof binders and a small, sealed metal lockbox. A heavy wave of crushing disappointment washed over Thomas. He let out a long, shaky breath, feeling the cold air bite at his lungs. Binders? He thought desperately. How are old plastic binders going to pay off $500,000? Still, he reached down and pulled the top binder out of the safe. It was heavy and covered in dust. He unzipped the waterproof cover and slowly opened the first page. His disappointment quickly turned into absolute shock. The pages were filled with incredibly detailed, perfectly preserved livestock genetics records. There were complex family trees, daily temperature charts, and hundreds of scientific notes written in his father's familiar handwriting. As Thomas rapidly flipped through the pages, the incredible truth finally hit him. His father hadn't just been raising ordinary cows in secret. For over 30 years, William Hayes had quietly been breeding an elite, cold weather-resistant line of Angus cattle. He had successfully created a super breed that could survive the deadliest winter storms, produce massive amounts of healthy beef, and thrive on a fraction of the normal feed. Thomas stared at the pages in complete awe. He remembered the old stories farmers used to whisper around the feed store. Rumors of a legendary, perfect bloodline of winter cattle that had supposedly died out decades ago. It was a famous bloodline thought to be completely extinct. But it wasn't extinct. His father had perfected it. And he had documented every single piece of DNA inside these binders. Thomas looked down at the metal lockbox sitting inside the safe, finally understanding the true value of what he had found. His father hadn't left him paper money. He had left him a biological gold mine. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a bright, cold light over the snow-covered ranch. Thomas had not slept a single wink. As soon as the roads were just clear enough to drive, he fired up his old, rusted pickup truck. Resting safely on the passenger seat were the thick black binders and the heavy metal lockbox from the floor safe. He drove carefully over the dangerously icy country roads, heading straight into town. His destination was the county agricultural center. He needed to see Dr. Miller, a highly respected livestock genetics specialist and one of the few men his father had actually ever trusted. Thomas walked into the warm, quiet office and placed the heavy binders right on Dr. Miller's wooden desk. "Morning, Thomas. What do you have there?" the older man asked gently, pushing his thick reading glasses up his nose. "I think my father left something important behind," Thomas said quietly. "I need you to tell me exactly what this is." Dr. Miller opened the first waterproof binder. At first he just skimmed the pages casually. But within a few short seconds his movements completely stopped. He leaned much closer to the desk, his eyes darting quickly across the complex family trees and detailed scientific notes. He flipped to the next page and then the next. The room was completely silent except for the rapid rustling of paper. Slowly, Dr. Miller took his glasses off and looked up at Thomas. His face was pale with absolute shock. "Thomas," Dr. Miller whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "Do you have any idea what your father achieved here?" Thomas shook his head. "I know he was secretly breeding cold-weather cattle. An old, lost bloodline." "It's not just a lost bloodline," Dr. Miller said, tapping his finger hard against the heavy paper. "This is the holy grail of winter livestock. Modern cattle are struggling terribly with these new harsh winters. Entire herds are freezing and farmers are going bankrupt trying to feed them. But your father engineered a pure, unstoppable superbreed. These animals could easily survive the deadliest storms on a fraction of the normal feed." Dr. Miller then reached for the small metal lockbox Thomas had brought from the vault. He popped the simple metal latch open. Inside were neat stacks of official, stamped laboratory certificates. The doctor gasped out loud. "He didn't just write it down, Thomas. He saved them. According to these legal certificates, your father successfully froze hundreds of viable embryos from this exact superbreed at the State University's Secure Science Lab years ago. They are sitting there right now, perfectly preserved, legally registered under your family's name." Thomas felt his knees go weak. He had to hold onto the edge of the desk to keep from falling over. Are they worth anything?" Dr. Miller let out a breathless, amazed laugh. "Worth anything? Thomas, this forgotten genetics record is an absolute gold mine. The biggest livestock companies in the country have been trying to breed a cold-weather cow exactly like this for 20 years and failed. They will pay an absolute fortune for the exclusive rights to this bloodline." A massive wave of relief washed over Thomas. The farm was saved. He finally had a way to pay off the terrible bank debt. "But there is a catch," Dr. Miller said, his face suddenly growing very serious. "These giant corporate deals take a lot of time. They have to send their own lawyers, run tests and verify the lab samples. How much time do you have left before the bank forecloses?" "Less than 3 weeks," Thomas said, swallowing hard. Dr. Miller quickly grabbed his desk phone. "Then we don't have a single second to waste. I'm calling the biggest buyers right now. We have to make a deal before the auction clock runs out." For 2 agonizing weeks, Thomas waited by the telephone. Dr. Miller was negotiating with a massive genetics company, but corporate paperwork moved painfully slow. And the auction clock was still ticking. Just as a tiny ray of hope had returned to the ranch, nature decided to strike one last devastating blow. The sky turned a bruised, ugly purple. The weather radio buzzed with emergency warnings. Within hours, the absolute worst blizzard of the decade slammed into North Dakota. Temperatures plummeted to dangerous depths, and the snow fell so fast it created a complete, blinding whiteout. Thomas knew his current herd of regular cattle was trapped in the lower pasture. Without a massive delivery of heavy high-energy feed, they would freeze and starve to death before morning. He quickly bundled up and ran to his modern feed truck. He jumped inside and turned the key. Click. Yes. Silence. Thomas pumped the gas pedal and twisted the key again, but the engine was completely dead. The extreme, bitter cold had shattered the modern battery and frozen the electronic fuel lines solid. The expensive truck was totally useless. Panic gripped Thomas's chest. His animals were out there in the dark, suffering, and he had no way to reach them. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel. But Thomas Hayes was not a man who surrendered. If the modern world failed him, he would rely on pure, old-fashioned grit. He fought his way through the roaring wind to the main machinery shed. He marched straight past the broken modern truck and yanked the heavy canvas tarps off his father's vintage equipment. There, shining in the dim light, sat the classic John Deere tractor and an old heavy-duty Schuler 2000 feed wagon. They were dusty and completely mechanical. No delicate computer chips, no fragile wires. Just raw, heavy iron. Thomas jumped into the John Deere, fired it up, and carefully backed it toward the massive Schuler 2000. Hooking up the heavy machinery was supposed to be a two-man job, but Thomas was completely alone. He climbed down into the freezing dirt. The wind screamed through the cracks in the shed, biting through his thick coat. He had to lift the incredibly heavy steel hitch of the wagon to connect it to the tractor. His fingers went completely numb inside his thick leather gloves. He strained his back, pulling the heavy iron bar upward, but the freezing metal slipped from his grip. He fell hard to his knees, gasping for breath, his muscles burning with intense, sharp pain. It would have been so easy to stay on the ground and quit. But the mental image of his cows freezing in the dark forced him back to his feet. With a loud, powerful yell, Thomas grabbed the icy steel bar again. He used every ounce of strength left in his tired body. He lifted the hitch and slammed the thick metal locking pin firmly into place. Thomas scrambled back into the freezing cab of the John Deere. He threw the tractor into gear and drove straight out into the terrifying blizzard. The wind hit the glass like a hammer, but the Green Giant pushed forward like an unstoppable tank. The rusty Schuler 2000 rolled smoothly behind it, loaded with life-saving grain. When Thomas finally reached the lower pasture, his cows were huddled closely together, crying out in hunger. As the Schuler 2000 began pouring warm, sweet-smelling feed into the long metal troughs, the herd rushed forward. Thomas sat in the cold cab watching them eat, wiping freezing tears from his face. The storm was doing everything it could to break him, but he proved exactly why he deserved to keep this land. He would never, ever abandon his animals. The 30 days were officially over. The terrible, howling blizzard had finally passed, leaving behind a painfully bright, cold morning. The sun rose high over the quiet, snow-covered North Dakota landscape, but there was no peace on the Hayes Ranch today. The loud, ugly sound of heavy diesel engines broke the morning silence. The massive county farm equipment auction was setting up directly in Thomas's front yard. Strangers in thick winter coats stomped across the snow, hammering wooden auction signs into the frozen dirt. A fast-talking auctioneer was testing a loud microphone on the back of a flatbed truck. The sight was absolutely heartbreaking. Everything Thomas loved, everything his father had built with his bare hands, was about to be sold off to the highest bidder. Mr. Harrison, the bank manager, stepped out of his warm silver car. He pulled his heavy coat tight against the biting cold, looking sad but strictly professional. Behind him rolled 3 large heavy-duty tow trucks. Their yellow lights flashed brightly as they drove straight toward the main machinery shed. Their target was obvious: the classic John Deere tractor and the trusty Schuler 2000 feed wagon. They were the most valuable items on the property, and the rich buyers wanted them taken away first. Along the wooden fence line, dozens of local farmers and old neighbors stood watching in complete silence. They had known Thomas his whole life. They had deeply respected his father. Seeing the tow trucks back up to the beautiful green tractor felt like watching a tragic ending to a great story. The neighbors hung their hats, truly believing that Thomas had finally lost the long, hard fight. The loud warning beeps of a backing tow truck echoed across the icy yard. A driver jumped down into the snow, carrying a thick, heavy iron chain. He walked directly toward the front of the John Deere, ready to lock it up and drag it away forever. "Drop that chain," a deep, powerful voice boomed across the yard. The tow truck driver froze instantly, dropping the heavy metal chain into the snow with a loud clank. The auctioneer stopped talking. The neighbors looked up. Everyone turned their heads toward the old farmhouse. The heavy wooden front door swung wide open, and Thomas stepped out onto the porch. He was not packing his bags to leave. He was not hanging his head in defeat. He stood tall and proud, looking stronger than he had in years. In his rough, tired hands he wasn't holding a white flag. He was holding a thick, certified legal folder and a single, crisp piece of paper. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, looking confused and nervous. "Thomas, the 30 days are up. The paperwork is finalized. I told you I couldn't stop the trucks." "You don't need to stop them, Mr. Harrison," Thomas said, a quiet, confident smile spreading across his face. "Because they are trespassing." At that exact moment, the sound of a smooth, quiet engine turned every head toward the main gate. A sleek, shiny black corporate car, completely out of place on a messy, snow-covered farm road, rolled slowly into the yard. It drove right past the confused auctioneer and parked directly in front of Thomas. The doors opened and 3 men wearing expensive winter suits stepped out into the freezing snow. They were not local farmers, and they were certainly not there to buy used tractors. They were top executive representatives from the biggest livestock genetics company in the entire country. And they had come strictly for Thomas. Thomas walked slowly down the wooden porch steps, his heavy boots crunching softly in the fresh snow. The 3 corporate executives stood quietly behind him, looking completely out of place but deeply respectful. Thomas walked right past the massive, flashing tow trucks and stopped directly in front of Mr. Harrison. Without saying a single word, Thomas handed the bank manager the crisp piece of paper he had been holding. Mr. Harrison took it, his eyes darting down to read the bold print. It was a certified cashier's check from one of the largest corporate banks in America. Mr. Harrison blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked at the paper again. His jaw dropped completely open. The check was not just for $500,000. It was for a much, much higher amount. The massive genetics company had paid an absolute fortune for the exclusive rights to his father's hidden winter bloodline. The terrible debt was completely wiped out, and there was plenty of money left over to keep the Hayes Ranch running for generations to come. "Thomas? I don't understand," Mr. Harrison stammered, completely shocked. "Is this real?" "It is very real, Mr. Harrison," Thomas said firmly. "The loan is paid in full. Now, please tell those men to get off my property." The bank manager quickly turned around, waving his arms frantically in the cold air. "Stop. Shut it down. Cancel the auction," he yelled to the surprised auctioneer. He then turned to the tow truck drivers. "Unhook the chains. Leave the equipment where it is. We are done here." The local farmers and neighbors standing by the fence line erupted into loud, joyful cheers. Men threw their winter hats into the air, clapping and whistling. They had watched Thomas fight through the worst storms, the darkest days, and the heaviest burdens. To see him win was a massive victory for every hard-working farmer in the county. The tow trucks slowly pulled their chains back up and drove away empty-handed, leaving the beautiful John Deere exactly where it belonged. By noon, the yard was completely empty. The auction signs were gone, the corporate car had driven back to the city, and the loud noise was replaced by the peaceful, quiet sound of the winter wind. Thomas walked slowly back toward the main machinery shed. The bright sunlight caught the deep green paint of the classic John Deere tractor. Thomas reached out, resting his rough, tired hand gently on the cold metal hood. He gave it a soft pat, feeling a deep, powerful connection to the man who had built it. He walked out of the shed and looked up at the bright blue North Dakota sky. Warm tears finally filled his eyes, but this time they were tears of pure joy. "You saved us, Dad," Thomas whispered to the open sky. "Thank you for looking into the future." The terrible winter was finally ending. The farm was completely safe. And when the warm spring finally arrived, a brand new, unstoppable herd of cattle would be born, carrying the Hayes legacy forward forever. If you loved watching Thomas save his family's farm, please smash that like button and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Have you ever faced a tough winter or relied on old equipment? Drop a comment down below and share your own unique farming experiences with us.